Actually, clustering Liferay starts with looking at the surroundings, at all of the infrastructure, because I've announced this is now when we actually cluster Liferay. To be honest, we'll actually cluster in the next chapter, but clustering the servers will start here. What are we doing? Why cluster? We distribute the load across multiple servers. We provide backup machines when one goes down. Quick repetition of the previous chapter. We can easily do this. We'll pay attention to some of the layers here just because we need them. And the first one is load balancing and the web tier. Load balancers are typically coming as a separate either device, separate software, but most likely as separate hardware. We have the application tier, which is what we look at today, which is our Tomcat in this case. So we will be clustering on Tomcat, but the principle applies to all other application servers as well. All the principles are the same. We will pay specific attention to the cache, the search, and the documents, because that's what we actually need to cluster. We're kind of set for the documents already due to our Docker setup. So if we just look at our Docker setup that we currently have, we might just miss an important feature here. The database tier, we will take care of that, but as it says here today, we will work with a single database. If your MySQL fails, then probably your notebook fails, and that's good enough. So you can set it up in a cluster, not today. I have briefly talked about session affinity and, well, basically sticky sessions is another word for it, which means whenever you start a session on your load balancer has no clue where to put you to. The load balancer is the machine that determines if you go to server 1 or server 2. And session affinity means it decides so exactly once, and then afterwards it tags your session, and it will always distribute you to the same server again. And this is the sweet spot. And I would say 95%, I'm just making that number up, but it's like way above 90%. This is what I like to see in Liferay installations. Rarely is there a necessity with any business reason to go to random servers back and forth, because you want all of that state that is in main memory in a server to just be reused and not just go to all random servers in your cluster. With that, we have sticky sessions, we have server affinity. You will be staying with the one node that you have started with. Now, configuring the session affinity is actually quite easy, because on Tomcat, or basically what do we need to look for? We need to look for the load balancer, which needs to know what's the criterion for balancing somebody to one machine. And we need the application server to basically provide that criterion. In our case, that's a tag on Tomcat. That's the name of the Tomcat machine that gets just added to the session ID. And that's what the load balancer can see. So we will configure the load balancer to be aware of all of the nodes in the cluster, and configure the application server to make itself known, provide the name. I went ahead of myself. Here's the slide about session replication. If you really, really, really need session replication, I would say in 90% of the cases you're wrong. Quite often I see people really, really, really wanting session replication, but not really, really, really needing session replication. Important difference. But if you really want session replications, there are ways to make it relatively performant, so you don't need to distribute all of the sessions to all of the servers, but you can just configure pairs of them or store the session state in the database so that it's only being fetched on demand. So not everything is bad with full session replication, but it's still by far the secondary choice. There are a few informations here. Clustering JavaEE servers. This is the abstract way to think about it, and I'll actually have to peek here. Traffic entering the firewall will pass through the web server, so naturally we will need to decrypt everything. The load balancer is always the SSL termination that we see, and then it depends on your setup if you re-encrypt for in-data center communication or if you don't. Again, that's a policy question. I can't answer that. Whatever you need, whatever you do. The web servers, sometimes in unison with the load balancers, just act as reverse proxies. And and this is the configuration that we look for. Configuring communication between web servers and the application servers is often done through HTTP again. So your web server speaks HTTP to your server, to your Tomcat or application server. There's also another protocol named AJP. If you need encrypted traffic within your data center, HTTP or HTTPS might be simpler. If you don't need encrypted traffic, AJP is a binary protocol that's very similar to HTTP, but it can't be encrypted unless you tunnel it. So yes, you can build a VPN between your servers and then tunnel your AJP connection through there, but that's a limitation. We have our web server and we have our, I'll just go with Tomcat. But whatever app server will be fine. If we communicate through HTTP, the address of your Tomcat might be your internal data center address. Let's make it so that I don't write too much, 10.0.0.1. If you make an HTTP request from the browser to the web server, you might be on example.com. That's what the browser sees. Now Apache or your web server makes an HTTP request to Tomcat. Tomcat sees 10.0.0.1, tells Liferay, this is my address. So whatever address, whatever URL Liferay generates or Tomcat generates will have this IP address. If this is embedded in HTML and the browser gets it, guess what the browser tries? It tries to connect to 10.0.0.1. And of course won't find it. Problem. If you do the same thing through AJP, it will magically work. How does that happen? Well, because AJP is exactly for this kind of communication. Does this never work? No, there are certain options that you can use to make them work. If you use Apache, there's a directive called proxy preserve host. So Tomcat will know that this connection actually went to a different host. You can forward that. Next problem is if this is HTTPS, sorry for it to be unreadable, if this is HTTPS here from the browser to your web server and it forwards through HTTP, Tomcat will say, oh, this connection has not been encrypted. That's a problem. That's what AJP handles for you, but not HTTP. Again, you can configure around this. You can tell Tomcat anything that comes in on a specific port actually has been encrypted. I know better and has been encrypted well enough for you to state to Tomcat, well, you might not have gotten it encrypted, but I'll tell you, well, trust me, it's encrypted. So you can do that, but you'll actually need to do that. That's why I personally prefer AJP, because it just does everything automatically, while HTTP doesn't. I gotta do some extra work, but sometimes it is what you need, sometimes it isn't. Is there any correct way? No. So what do you need? It depends. When you deploy an application like Liferay to a cluster, you don't mind who or which server serves the content. So you better make sure that both or all of the servers in your cluster contain the same applications, the same setup. With your application server, you may just be able to use its cluster feature, its farm feature, and you might be able to just configure it, or you are typically able to configure it to deploy everything everywhere. Now remember I told you about Liferay having its own OSGI container, where the application server is unaware of the OSGI container, which means you better make sure that all of Liferay's plugins are deployed to all of your systems. As I say here, with standard Java web apps like servlets and so on, cluster deployment is pretty straightforward. I would say the very first one here, or many of them, just apply to Tomcat easily, because Tomcat doesn't really have any default way of handling cluster. There are some plugins that you can install, but out of the box, Tomcat doesn't have any cluster operations. So you can manually deploy them. You can use rsync to basically synchronize them. You can, well, the last one is then what you use with a proper server. You use these server clusters. However, in Liferay, that's not quite sufficient because we need to take care of the OSGI container as well. An easy way that we are using in this course is we're building both instances that we create from the same Docker image. So naturally, they are the same, they are identical. Quite a neat way to do so. As this is a Liferay course, I'll just point you to Tomcat Farms. There are Tomcat Farms that you can build with an extra plugin, and you can enable all of this easily, but I won't cover that with Tomcat. Similar, there are several ways to provide cluster deployments in JBoss, in WebSphere, and so on, and I also won't cover them right now. Now, I've started this chapter by saying we will start to cluster Liferay. In order to cluster Liferay, we will be starting with HAProxy, which we have chosen as the one load balancer that we use. It's basically a load balancer and web tier in our situation. We have prepared the image in your Docker Compose file. There are some lines commented out, and the exercise will basically make you enable HAProxy, and then you can run it, which probably is a 2-minute exercise with all of the exercise step. Clustering allows us to distribute user load across multiple servers and provide backup machines when one goes down. Careful, it doesn't provide you backups, it just provides you backup machines. Liferay is designed for high availability situations and scales well when clustered. This is something that I haven't talked about, but we have made some performance tests on Liferay, and it actually scales quite well. So if you need twice the amount of load that you get from one server, you need twice the amount of servers that you had previously. Tomcat-specific one, when a Tomcat Farm is enabled, web apps installed on one node get replicated across the cluster. However, as Liferay always only installs one web app, I would say this is in 7.0 and 7.1 times, in DXP times, not so relevant anymore. But with former versions, it was more relevant, because there you could actually really deploy the web apps throughout the cluster this way. Okay, coming back to the exercise, if you didn't start it yet, we will need HAProxy, so this is not an optional exercise, but it's a quick one. Ready, set, go.